How goes things, you beautiful people? It's Jake the Ashen Hollow. In this video, we're going to start what I imagine will be a multiple-part series on the Deep, as there is much to be heard about it, and much more to be learned in either of the upcoming DLCs, I highly suspect. Let's start with the question, what is the Deep? It's hard to narrow down what the Deep is exactly, but I think the safest bet is that it's some form of the Abyss. Whether it is a controlled-like substance of the Abyss, or perhaps another branch of Abyss sorceries and or miracles, or maybe a new type of Abyss altogether, that much isn't too important to this video. Just a question you should consider as we learn more about the Deep. So let me draw your attention to a large piece of this puzzle, the Cathedral of the Deep. The Cathedral, and by the way, I'm just going to be calling it the Cathedral from here on out. Having to say Cathedral of the Deep every time will be bothersome. Anyways. The cathedral, I believe, used to belong to the Way of White, so let's explore that thought. The first thing that led me to this assumption is all the Allfather Lloyd memorabilia. Let's read the description of Lloyd's sword ring we find in the cathedral. Much time has passed since the worship of Lloyd was common in the Way of White. The clerics of Kareem had always strongly asserted that Lloyd was a derivative fraud and that the Allfather title was self-proclaimed. Now hang on to this information as I'll bring it up again at some point in this series. I just wanted to connect Allfather Lloyd to the Way of White, as I know some of my viewers haven't played through Dark Souls 1 yet. One thing we know about the Way of White and Allfather Lloyd from our time in Lordran is that their clerics often went on undead hunts, as the undead are considered accursed creatures and used their Lloyd talismans to prevent them from healing. Here in the cathedral, we find the only enemies who drop undead hunter charms. Let's read the description for that real quick. Tool used to hunt down the undead. Block Estus recovery within a limited area. Used long ago by Lloyd's cleric knights on their undead hunts. Although Allfather Lloyd is long forgotten by the Way of White, his hunts have lived on, and this charm allows one to challenge undead without fear of tenacious healing. So we find the same charms from Dark Souls 1 looted from the man grubs that inhabit the cathedral, and they're the only enemies that drop it in the game. We can of course purchase them from the handmaiden, but only after we give her the paladin's ashes, which, ironically enough, are found right outside the cathedral. But I think it's important to consider that the cathedral used to belong to the Way of White. Also, upon reading any description from the Archdeacon's set, it says, Holy garb worn by an archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep, a sign of the Way of White's highest rank. So basically that ties my whole point together. It makes a lot of sense really, even when considering the road of sacrifices that is used for transporting undead to the cathedral. Who knows what Allfather Lloyd was up to way back when. He kinda rubs me as one of those stereotypical super corrupt hypocrite religious leaders. Anyways, the cathedral used to be a divine place, peaceful even, before the Deep corrupted it and those involved. If we read the Deep Braille Divine Tome, it says, A Braille Divine Tome of the Deep belonging to the deacons of the cathedral, intended to teach divine protection to the deacons of the Deep, but later dark tales were added to its pages such that it is now considered a thing profane. It was intended to teach divine arts, but later, I'm suspecting after the Deep contaminated the deacons, bishops, etc., the dark tales were written in its pages. Let's read the description of Deep Protection. Miracle taught to inaugurated deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The Deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things. This tale of the Deep offers protection to those who worship amidst those horrors. We learn quite a bit here. The Deep used to be a peaceful and sacred place. That is pretty curious, especially if we consider it to be related to the Abyss. What this makes me think is that inside the cathedral they were experimenting with the Abyss, perhaps to harness its powers or to understand it in terms of fighting it back in the always looming Age of Dark. But if the Deep used to be peaceful, at what point did peaceful become a nightmare? The Deacon Robe says, Robe worn by deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The deep red pigment denotes the blessing of fire. In time, those dedicated to sealing away the horrors of the Deep succumbed to their very power. It seems that neither tending to the flame nor the faith could save them. Here we learn that there were those dedicated to sealing away the horrors of the Deep, but we're still not learning at what point things went sideways. If I had to guess, I would say it had something to do with Aldrich. I suspect that the cathedral had always to some extent held back the horrors of the deep. If they were screwing around with the abyss, that would make sense. Perhaps the word peaceful simply could come from the fact that they had it under control. So technically things were peaceful as long as they had control. After staring at this information for hours and hours, that's what I've come up with, so let's run with it. Hawkwood tells us that Aldrich was once a proper cleric before he started devouring men, until the point he bloated like a drowned pig and softened into sludge. Then they stuck him in the Cathedral of the Deep and went on to make him a Lord of Cinder. But I think between sticking him in the cathedral and making him a Lord of Cinder is when shit went from 0 to 100 in the cathedral. Let's read the soul of the Deacons of the Deep. It says, after Aldrich left for the Boreal Valley, Archdeacon Royce remained in the cathedral with the high priests to keep eternal watch over their master's coffin. So after the Lords of Cinder rose from their graves, Aldrich took off to Irithyll, consumed Gwyndolin, and so on and so forth. But at this point he was already the master of the Cathedral of the Deep, which likely means he ruled, for lack of a better word, over the deacons before he was made a Lord of Cinder. It's likely Aldrich influenced his way to power after being brought to the cathedral by various means. I believe this is what stemmed the corruption and atrocities that would become the Deep we know today. First off, the dude ate people. That's usually a red flag, for me anyways. Sheesh. But apparently, Aldrich's influence spread quite a bit. He's the figurehead of the cathedral now, and what I suppose is left of the Way of White, if you'd even consider calling it that anymore. Certainly completely different principles. We see a lot of deacons, especially the ones in blue garb, which indicates a higher ranking than the typical deacon, are all fat and bloated themselves. My theory is that they wanted to emulate their new master in his habit of devouring men. Let's read Aldrich's sapphire. It says, a malformed ring left by Aldrich, Saint of the Deep. Aldrich, infamous for his appetite for flesh, apparently had the desire to share with others his joy of imbibing the final shudders of life while luxuriating in his victims' screams. So he shared this hobby of his with others, let them see the joy he took in it. It is no wonder why his followers would want to imitate this. Also, we see Aldrich referenced as Saint of the Deep here, so now to me, it almost seems that they made him into a martyr of sorts. Not super sure. I randomly spitball sometimes. You guys know me pretty well enough to know that by now. Either way, the point of all this is I think it was Aldrich that corrupted everything and led the way for the Deep to corrupt everything near it. The Deep ring reads, a ring bestowed upon the deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. In the cathedral slumber things most terrible, and as such, the deacons require a grand narrative to ensure they do not falter in their duty. A philosophy to ward away the madness beckoned by the grotesqueries at hand. So things were so terrible that the deacons had to have a grand narrative just to keep them doing their duty. That's pretty wicked. It seems likely that the Deep could be some sort of curse. An abyss curse? Could that be a thing? We see a lot of things in and of the cathedral that reference an unknown curse. The Great Curse Ward Great Shield reads, Great Shield given to those who resisted the curse long ago. Far too heavy for an ordinary person, perhaps it signifies the foolishness of resisting the curse. And yet, those who bear the weight of the shield will not find its protection against curses wanting. There's gotta be something that tells us the Deep could be a curse specifically. Well, I guess there is one thing. You know those giant, incredibly mother-flippin' freaky, furry, spider-like creatures we fight once in the cathedral, and then again in Anor Londo? Well, they are called Deep Accursed. That could be the clue we're looking for. There is someone else that speaks of curses related to the cathedral.
Poor child, come to me. Oh, cleanse the bastard's curse.
Let's read the Evangelist's robe. It says, Robe of an evangelist sent from the cathedral. These teachers, all women, came to enlighten inhabitants of the undead settlement and sent carriers on the path of sacrifice. Whose curse could they be trying to cleanse? The curse set off by Aldrich in the Deep? Wait, could the curse the Deep set off however long ago be what started the Undead Curse? Let's look into this prospect real quick. The Deep Gem says that there is a darkness that lies beyond humankind. The human dregs we collect for the Aldrich Faithful Covenant say, dregs are the heaviest thing within the human body and will sink to the lowest depths imaginable, where they become the shackles that bind this world. The lowest depths bind this world? That kind of sounds like the abyss, right? Then the deep soul says, souls which swell from the deep pursue their target, drawn towards life. That kind of works like the affinity sorcery, right? A manifestation of the dark of humanity. Then the great deep soul goes on to say, Archdeacon Madonnell, a sorcerer himself, delighted in the cathedral's stagnating souls. For him, they represented the glorious bedrock of this world. As far as we've seen, the abyss appears to be the bedrock of this world, kind of like the creepy basement of the world or some shit. In Dark Souls 1, we learned that a Firekeeper's soul is a draw for humanity, and that under a thin layer of their skin, humanity writhes and squirms. Now tell me if that sounds familiar as I read the Gnaw miracle description to you. Dark miracle taught in the Cathedral of the Deep. Summon insect swarm to feast on foes. These insects, which lurk in the deep, have tiny jaws lined with fangs to tear open the skin and burrow into the flesh in the blink of an eye, causing intense bleeding. Now, it isn't exactly the same, but I think you can understand the similarities. The liquidy goop we see in Aldrich's boss room, and perhaps even the sludge he's made out of, I believe could be the deep, which is super reminiscent of Manus' soul. Manus, who was spawning abyss all around him, was described as viscous. Viscous meaning having a thick, sticky consistency between solid and liquid. So these two substances seem awfully similar. Now, I'm not saying that this is how the Undead Curse started. I'm just pointing out the similarities and hovering over the prospect of it, which I think is important to do in the Dark Souls lore. It's vague enough as it is, we might as well make use of our imagination. I'm simply saying it could be a possibility. It could not. It's hard to say a lot of things for sure, because pinpointing a timeline in Dark Souls is incredibly difficult. So don't hold me to it, I just enjoy bringing up new things to ponder on. But back to talking about the deep. There was a new show on Netflix that came out a few months ago called Stranger Things. I don't know if you've seen it, but I would like to use an analogy from it without really spoiling anything. There is a creature that lives in a plane of existence that they call the Shadow Realm, or the Underneath. There was a laboratory of people running experiments, and they ended up opening a portal into their world that these creatures from the Shadow Realm could enter from their world. I think that concept is how the Deep started in the Cathedral, until too much got out and overwhelmed them. Let's read the Cathedral Knight armor. It says, repulsive creatures of the deep are sure to attract the foolish, but the Cathedral Knights are prepared to meet such intruders head-on with their more than ample might. So they had soldiers ready to battle these intruders. The word intruder is what made me think of the Stranger Things reference. The Cathedral Knights attempted to fight back these creatures coming from the deep, but we all know well enough it was only a matter of time before it all got out. But perhaps just being in or around the deep too long is what caused the fall. Dory's gnawing reads, those who linger too long on the brink of the deep will often slip. Dory's is sure to have wallowed in this darkness, intoxicated by its peril. So indeed, it was only a matter of time. So thanks for watching, everyone. We will continue these thoughts and ideas in part 2, but for now I must leave. Fret not, dear viewers of the deep. The theories slumbering in the dark will not sleep long.